We're continuing our look at the case for Christ, whether there's credible evidence that Jesus Christ was telling the truth when he claimed to be the one and the only Son of God. Today we're going to talk about corroborating evidence for Jesus Christ. What do we mean by corroborating evidence? Well, maybe the best way to explain it would be to give you an example. Several years ago, I covered a case for the Chicago Tribune, where I was a legal affairs editor, involving a crime syndicate hitman named Harry Alleman. Now, the authorities wanted to convict Harry Alleman of one of the many murders that they knew he committed, but they could never quite pin on him. They needed enough evidence to bring to a court of law like this one. One day they got lucky. They arrested Luis Almeida, who was a friend and a crony of the hitman Alleman, while Almeida was on his way to Pennsylvania to commit a murder for the crime syndicate. And because he was caught red-handed, Almeida decided to testify against his old buddy, Harry Alleman. And the authorities thought, this is great. We finally got some inside testimony to help put that hitman in prison. The problem was they couldn't rely just on Luis Almeida's testimony. Why? Because he had a motive to testify against his friend. They were going to go easy on him in the case that they had against him. So the authorities knew they had to find some corroborating evidence. Corroborating evidence is evidence that confirms other evidence. It can be a photograph, it can be some additional testimony, it could be a fingerprint, some other evidence that confirms other evidence against the defendant. And so they went searching, and they finally found another witness named Bobby Lowe, an average citizen who had no axe to grind. And Bobby Lowe was able to provide just enough corroboration of Almeida's testimony that the authorities were convinced they would put the hitman behind bars forever. Well, they presented the evidence to a judge. There was no jury in that particular case. And you would think that there would be a conviction. But this was Cook County, Illinois. A little bit of corruption in Cook County, Illinois. The judge finds the hitman innocent. Well, several years later, it's disclosed that the judge had taken a $10,000 bribe to release the hitman and to find him not guilty. So the prosecutors tried once more. They indicted, and in other words, they charged Harry Alleman once more with murder. And this time they presented the evidence to a jury. And sure enough, the jury convicted him and sentenced him to 100 to 300 years in prison. That's the power of corroborating testimony in a criminal case. Well, what about the case for Christ? Is there any corroborating evidence that backs up or confirms the evidence we've already talked about previously? That is, the eyewitness evidence for Jesus Christ. Well, as a matter of fact, there is some very interesting evidence from ancient history that does provide some corroboration for the life, the teachings, the miracle, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For instance, there's some writings from someone named Josephus. He was Jewish, he lived in the 1st century, and he became an historian for the Romans. And in his book called the Antiquities, he describes how a high priest named Ananias took advantage of the death of a Roman official in order to arrest and put to death James. In fact, this is what he writes in his book called the Antiquities. He convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Now, remember, the word Christ is Greek, meaning the anointed one, or the Messiah. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. And James was stoned to death. And we'll talk in later installments about the significance of that. But right here we have confirmation from Josephus, who is not a Christian, living right there in the 1st century, that there was someone named Jesus, and he was called the Christ. In other words, some people considered Jesus to be the Messiah. Now, there's another passage that Josephus writes. This one's a little more controversial. Let me just read it to you. He said, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, the reason that that's controversial is because some critics say, well, Josephus' writings, as they were passed down through time, Christians would insert things into his writings. For instance, when Josephus said Jesus is the Christ, well, we know from other writings that Josephus himself was not a Christian, so he probably wouldn't have called Jesus the Christ. So we can take out of the text that he wrote these things that had apparently been put in later by Christians. And when we do that, we still have very important affirmation about Jesus Christ. In fact, I went to Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, one of the leading classical scholars in the world, and I asked him, what can we discern positively and confidently about that passage from Josephus? And he said that we can conclude that Jesus was a martyred leader of the church in Jerusalem, and that he was a wise teacher who had established a wide and lasting following, despite the fact that he had been crucified under Pilate at the instigation of some Jewish leaders. Now that's very important in terms of corroborating some things about Jesus Christ. We also have some writings from someone named Tacitus. He also was an historian, and he lived in, just around the time of Jesus. And in the year 115, he talked about Jesus in a passage. He talked about Nero. He said, Nero fastened guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our leaders, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Notice how he says that, apparently it was quelled for a moment, but then it broke out again. And some historians say, well, Tacitus is unconsciously giving testimony to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, how the followers of Jesus were depressed and despondent when he was put to death, and it looked like the movement had died, but how it sprang back to life, surprisingly, when he was resurrected from the dead. But the writings of Tacitus also provide us with some corroboration about the life of Jesus. But one of the most interesting bits of corroboration comes from a person named Thallus. Thallus was a Greek historian. He wrote a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world in about 52 AD. Keep in mind that Jesus lived around, and was put to death around 30 or 33 AD. So Thallus was writing history since the Trojan War, and he wrote some things about Jesus, apparently, and I say apparently because his writings were lost. But in the year 221, another historian by the name of Julius Africanus quotes something that Thallus wrote. Listen to what he wrote, because, if you read the story about Jesus in the New Testament, it says that while he was on the cross, the earth went dark. And as a skeptic, I used to say, give me a break. You telling me the earth went dark when Jesus was on the cross? Don't you think somebody would have noticed other than the writers of the Bible? Well, listen to what Thallus, who was not a Christian, wrote about that. He said, quote, according to Julius Africanus, he's writing, and he says, Thallus, in the third book of his histories, explains away the darkness as an eclipse of the sun, unreasonably as it seems to me. So in other words, here you have Julius Africanus saying, hey, Thallus said it went dark. The earth went dark at the time that Jesus was on the cross. But Thallus tried to explain it away by saying it was an eclipse of the sun. However, we know from the timing of the crucifixion, it could not have been an eclipse of the sun. So here we have some affirmation for the darkness that fell over the earth. In fact, Paul Meyer, who wrote a book called Pontius Pilate, he is another classical historian, talked about this darkness. I think you'll find this fascinating. He says this phenomenon, evidently, was visible in Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. According to Tertullian, it was a cosmic or world event. Phlegon, a Greek author writing a chronology soon after 137 AD, reported that in 33 AD, that's when Jesus was put to death, there was, quote, the greatest eclipse of the sun, and that, quote, it became night in the 6th hour of the day, that is noon, so that the stars even appeared in the heavens. And then he talks about the great earthquakes that also were experienced. Now this is great corroboration of some of the claims that are written in the New Testament. So there is some affirmation, some corroboration for the writings in the Bible. Now, the quality of this corroboration, it varies all around the board. But there is some important information that we can glean from writers outside the Bible. In fact, there's a scholar by the name of Gary Habermas. He has 2 doctorates, including a doctorate from Michigan State University in the area of classical history. Dr. Habermas wrote a book called The Verdict of History. And in that book, he documents 100 different facts about the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that are found from writers outside the Bible. Several of those writers, including non-Christian writers, refer to the claims of divinity of Jesus Christ, that he was the Son of God. According to Dr. Habermas, his conclusion is the idea that Jesus is God is not some concept that grew up a long time after Jesus lived, as legend grew up and distorted the historical record. He's saying that the idea that Jesus is God goes right back to the very earliest days after his life. That's more corroboration for the writings in the New Testament and helps us have some confidence that the New Testament is accurate when it talks about Jesus Christ. These are some of the facts that we find corroborated in writings outside the Bible. Next time, we're going to look at some scientific evidence. What does archaeology have to say about the writings of the New Testament? Does archaeology corroborate or conflict with the claims made by the New Testament writers? We'll find that out next time. We'll take a recess right now in the case for Christ. Next time, we'll look at the scientific evidence in that case.